Welcome to Entrepreneurship to the Point. My name is Phakamisa Ndzamela. It is absolutely lovely to have everybody here with us. Tonight, I am interviewing author of Native Merchants, Phakamisa Ndzamela. So just a bit of background on Phakamisa. Phakamisa Ndzamela is a finance writer at Business Day and Financial Mail covering banks, insurance, private equity, asset management, Black economic empowerment, and other company news. In 2015, he spent time at the Financial Times in London. Ndzamela started working as an intern at Thomson Reuters and was later seconded to a graduate trainee program in London, where he learned how to write about corporate activity, macroeconomics, and news in general. In 2010, he gained experience at South African television broadcaster eNews and was a producer at eNews Africa. In mid-2010, he returned to financial journalism and joined the boutique financial news provider MoneyWeb, where he covered banks and insurers. While at MoneyWeb, he won the Best Newcomer at the Sanlam Awards of Excellence in Financial Journalism and a similar accolade at the Citadel Words on Money Journalism Awards. At the end of 2011, he joined Business Day as a general companies writer. He was later assigned to cover the financial services sector. At Business Day and Financial Mail, Ndzamela his work has been cited by global news agencies such as Bloomberg, Forbes, and many other publications. He has written for magazines such as The Banker SA, published by the Banking Association of South Africa, and The African Leader, a publication of the Black Management Forum, a non-racial and thought leadership organization. In 2013 to 2014, he was a producer at regional radio station Kaya FM and was part of a team that introduced a personal finance show aiming at driving financial inclusion by offering financial content aimed at educating ordinary South Africans. And Ndzamela completed a Bachelor of Arts honors degree in journalism at the University of Witwatersrand. So welcome, Phakamisa. It's great to have you join us this evening.
Thank you, Sipetile, and thank you to everybody who took the time to invite me here. I am honored. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So your book, Native Merchants, one of the reviews by Colin Bundy is that it's an engaging and highly readable overview of a largely overlooked history of Black entrepreneurship in South Africa that mines fascinating details from the archives. And just at the back here, it says, the story of Black business in South Africa remains underwritten. Now is the time to bring the stories of these remarkable, resilient people to the fore. So to our audience out there, this is the book, and I definitely recommend it for my, just the way it's like really hit me when I was reading it. I think it's a great piece of work. Now, I know as journalists, and particularly looking at Black empowerment, I'll be framing a lot of our discussion today around Triple BEE, because that's the main thing that's being driven by government to actually redress some of the things that actually took place that you write about in your book. And just before we go into that, would you tell the audience more about who inspired you to write the book? I know you go into a bit of detail in the book around that. So just from your own words, just so that we can get our audience just to know where it all comes from.
Sure. Good evening again to Property Point and its participants and members. Thanks again for inviting me here. Why did I write the book? The project started off as a manuscript of Black economic empowerment. An editor of mine at Business Day, Patrick Balger, asked me one evening after a long day writing a front page, why wasn't I writing a biography of a Black businessman, because such stories are underwritten. So one went on a journey with a friend of mine, Lindo Kulu, and we started interviewing a number of people, which I mentioned at the back of the book, who had participated in Black economic empowerment from its early days, post-1994. When we interviewed these people, the underlying view or the uniform takeaway was that we couldn't criticize Black economic empowerment and write about it meaningfully without understanding business participation of Black people historically. So what did that mean? It was simply a shambok that, listen, go back before. So we took that kindly. I went on the journey I moved to Cape Town, subsequently left Johannesburg, spent a lot of time at the archives, national libraries, universities, looking for information on the history of the participation of Black people. Of course, I must thank my wife, who was very patient. Machemo was very patient with me when I left the kids at home and went to the archives. It was a lonely process. So one started pre-94, got to the apartheid era, did pre-apartheid, because the apartheid era was very short, did pre-apartheid, and that's where the gems, were really found, especially in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. I think the youngest entrepreneur in the book was born in 1920, and his name is Richard Maponya. Besides that, people were born between 1850 and 1850 and early 1900s. So that's how far back I went, Siphetile.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving the context around that. And I must say, usually when it comes to reading books like this, there's like a lot of information. There's a lot of names, a lot of dates, and a lot of facts. And I think what you did quite well with the book is that even with those names, those facts, and those dates, it's a story that you can follow through. And just for the reader, when you're going to go through it, I like how you put it into different sections. Like we're looking at the financial institutions now, we're looking at this now, and when it comes to timelines, it's actually just weaving in between timelines, but focusing on specific sectors. And I just like how the way you did it, how it came together, and how you were able to pack in so much in less than 300 pages. So from my side, it's well done on that. So I just want to let the readers know that it's actually a very nice book to read. It's easy to follow, and it's actually quite awakening. And I must say, for me, it's the sort of thing that almost collapsed time. So it might sound a bit weird, but it kind of collapsed time for me, because we always think we're on this journey, on this progression journey. But when you look at what was said then and what is said now, it's the exact same thing. And we sometimes think, as the younger generation, oh, I'm having this brilliant awakening thought. And it's like, no, you have many people before you who've thought about this. So as a journalist, I know we usually talk about being objective when we're looking at these things, but one of my leaders actually said trying to find objectivity is like trying to pin jelly onto a wall. So it's just one of those things. And just from your perspective, when you were writing this, what are some of the emotions that came out for you, and what some of perspectives or beliefs were kind of challenged as you were doing this work?
Sure. So when you're writing about, so there's the biographical material in the book, which has profiles in the colonial era. And then there's what I would call the events section, which doesn't have a lot of profiles. And I'll explain why it doesn't have a lot of profiles. So if you look at the mining chapter, which starts in the 800s, it doesn't have individuals per se, because of the manner in which our history was recorded. but it's got nations in the Limpopo, in Phalaborwa, mining, both black men and women, participating in mining of gold, iron ore, copper, smelting some of those internally for internal consumption, exporting some of those precious metals to Asia through the Sofala region in East Africa. Then you get to the diamonds era, where everybody in South Africa, both black and white, male and female, were allowed to mine as long as they use their heads and hands and feet. Again, I do not have a lot of names there because the archive was so restrictive. The newspapers of the day and the diary recorders of the day only referred to black people with certain disparaging terms. They never deemed it important to write their full names. Having said that, it is acknowledged that black people from 1867 until 1875 had mining rights in Kimberley. They mined in their own right, on their own account, sold their diamonds the way they deemed it fit and the value they thought was appropriate for those stones. The fourth stone actually was found by a Khoi woman, and it was a 61 carat diamond, which was sold for about 300 pounds by her. She found that enough. It was later sold to England for just over 1,000 pounds. Unfortunately, in 1875, due to chauvinism from a certain group of people who couldn't compete with black people, deemed it appropriate that black people should lose their licenses to mine diamonds. Now, that was sad because if you look at South Africa today and you look at what is called old money, it often originates from the diamond mines. You know, the diamond mines really hastened South Africa to an industrial capitalist economy. Yes, we had an agricultural economy, which was wool, big, but diamonds really hastened South Africa to an industrial capitalist economy. And the people who made money in Kimberley were able to invest it in Johannesburg, on the Witwatersrand, in the emerging gold fields. Now, black people couldn't participate as miners on their own right on the Witwatersrand in the gold boom because their licenses were stripped in Kimberley. So that was very emotive, but one had to be very, balanced about it. I couldn't insert myself here and insert my opinions. I had to be restricted to the archive and the facts provided by history books and the archive. I couldn't insert my own opinions, and that was it. So it is emotive, but when you write history, you learn that you do not write about beautiful things only. You also write about negative things. There's really bad stuff that happens to some black business people around their sexual behavior, around their business behavior. We've got to record both the positive and the negative in any biography, and that is apparent. And the reason why you've got to park your emotions aside and write both the positive and negative is so that the next generation can learn from the positives and the negatives of their forebearers.
Thank you so much. And just talking about that, actually, which is why I was talking about how we always think there's progress. I mean, when we look at mining today and how many barriers of entry there are to mining for Black people versus that time in Kimberley, where it was much more accessible for Black people to mine until the restrictions came. So there's always like this one step forward, two steps back sort of thing. And that's what makes understanding and learning history so important, so that we actually, like you mentioned at the beginning, you know what you're writing about, and you know what you're commenting on, and you know what your opinion is about. So looking at...
But to that point, sorry for cutting you, Sepetil, to that point of mining, if you read the book, you will understand why this government introduced the mining charter.
Yes. Yes.
You know, people throw a song and dance. This creates uncertainty. And the reason why the mining charter was created is because Black people were reduced to laborers in Kimberley.
Yes.
When they didn't sit back, when they stood up and wanted to mine, but people did not want to compete. So you've got to understand the mining charter in that context from a triple BEE perspective.
That's correct. And I think that's, like you said, we can't critique BEE or talk about BEE without understanding this. And when you actually look at the archives, and I must say, you actually put down the facts as they were. And when it came to agriculture, when Black people could still own land, when it came to agriculture, Black people outperformed white farmers, or Black farmers outperformed white farmers. And because of that, they were disenfranchised of their land. And with mining, again, removing the competition in mining. So when we talk about Black people having to have some entrepreneurial drive, etc., or we can't give land back to Black people because they cannot produce on the land, when we have this context that by virtue of your color, it's not because you can't mine or you can't have agriculture by virtue of your color, but in these archives we show that Black people outproduced and can once again. So that does not mean that you're taking away from uncertainty of the economy. So,
no, correct, Spetil. I mean, and this is not me. This is not something that I've dreamed up. Again, if we're going to talk about the agricultural sector code or how we need redress in agriculture, we've got to look back and ask ourselves what happened. There were wars of dispossession in South Africa, in all colonies, the Cape Colony, the Natal Colony, Bechuanaland was also a colony, a Cape Colony at some point. You know, in all colonies, almost in all corners of what we call South Africa, there were wars of dispossession. And unfortunately, those wars of dispossession were lost by Black people. Before the peak of those land losses, and this is not me, I quote now Colin Bundy, who's a professor of history, who's now sitting in Oxford and who helped me edit the book. You know, in his book, The Rise and Fall of the South African Peasantry, which is quoted or cited in Native Merchants, Prof. Bundy says, by 1835, when the city of Port Elizabeth handled 80,000 pounds of agricultural export produce, it is estimated that about 50,000 to 60,000 pounds of the goods were obtained from Xhosa producers. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that people who I call natives in South Africa were not just interested in farming for subsistence. They farmed and they used the surplus to sell it. You know, it wasn't just for consumption. And unfortunately, dispossession did a huge number. You've got to look at the Nembulas of Natal, 1848 to 1850. Those guys, you know, Nembula had adopted Christianity and he worked with Mkhwanazi, his partner. They started a sugar mill. Yes, they had the sugar cane, but they had a sugar mill, which would be an equivalent of Ilovo or Hewlett's today. And They produce sugar. Think in the 1850s, they took samples of their sugar to the Paris Agricultural Exhibition. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what was happening? Of course, we've got to highlight that the Nembulas also had challenges. Yes, they had raised 500 pounds to buy a sugar mill. And they worked, but business is business. There were cycles in commodities, and they got hit by a downturn in global commodities in the 1850s, and their mill suffered. So the book is not just about making race-based excuses. Yes, race-based comments are made, rightfully so, but businesses of Black people also collapsed because of macroeconomic matters, also collapsed because of mismanagement, also collapsed because of poor succession planning.
Yeah, so just on that point, I think you actually did put that in quite well in the book. And I think what's the most important is that there is a starting point. So there's a starting point where all small businesses are hit by red tape. All small businesses are hit by poor funding. All small businesses are hit by monopolies, are hit by big business, all of them. It's just that in addition to that, so there were, I'll just quickly skip to when we look at the entrepreneurship culture. We always say we want to build an entrepreneurial culture in South Africa, or we want Black people to get an entrepreneurial culture. And when you actually look at this, it's not something to be taught. It's something that's already in Black people in South Africa. When you looking at your book and you go back to the mines, when you had Amawasha, who saw the gap in the market to do laundry services for the miners. They went in there, saw the gap. That's what we call an entrepreneur, solved the gap, and were making a very good living. And then when they saw that gap, when they saw that gap and they saw just how much money was being made there, then there were laws to legislate them out of that market. And then out of legislating them out of that market, then European business people took over that market. And then when it came to miners being disenfranchised in licensing, then Black businesses saw a gap in the market to be estate agents or be brokers. Then again, they were legislated out of that. And then we look at like different things, and then we're going to look at Baloy and Co in the transporting business versus Patco. So then again, Baloy and Co saw a gap in the market of giving transport to Black people. And then once that was seen as a lucrative business, again, Black people were legislated out of it. And then Patco was brought in, and they were on top of it subsidized by government to become successful. So when we talk about BEE and it being another race legislation, in fact, you quote an article in the 50s from the Burger when they talk about the insurance company that was created that wanted Black people to be in all managerial positions, that it was another way of apartheid. In fact, if Black people have been legislated out of those markets, then it is only legislation that can undo all of that, which comes through the form of BEE. Of course, we can critique BEE on what are the shortcomings of BEE, what are the successes of BEE. Of course, it's not perfect either. So when you just look at those kind of things and you just understand that really it's not something that needs to be taught to Black people to be entrepreneurial. They always have been. So what could we as South Africans do better in making sure that Black entrepreneurship isn't plundered? I mean, what are some of the ideas that may have been sparked during writing your book. I mean, one of the things that's happening today, for example, is Bonang fighting for her own brand with Celebrity Services Africa. Again, her brand being mined and kind of plundered. So what are some of the ideas that came out?
Sure. So I think what we learned from the native merchants, like the Amawasha, perhaps let's explain to the participants, what's the Amawasha that you rightfully mentioned, Siphetile. The Amawasha were the Mkunu and the Butelezi people from KwaZulu. What did they do? So you will recall that earlier when the session started, I indicated that Black people were dispossessed of their mining licenses. So what do Black people do when they lose their mining licenses? They look for adjacent industries to mining. That is entrepreneurship as a start. When someone comes and blocks you as a small business, whether it's a monopoly or an oligopoly, and they block you, you don't give up. You look for adjacent industries or adjacent opportunities to those sectors. And that is what the Amawasha did. They started a laundry service business on the Witwatersrand. They knew that mining was very patriarchal, that the people in the mines needed to have laundry services because of the dust, right? The soot that covered everybody. And the Amawasha came to the fore and they provided laundry services. Now, this is what research tells us. It says the Braamfontein Estate Company, which had rented out property to the Amawasha. The Amawasha in the mid-1890s had paid £2,400 in rent to the Braamfontein Estate Company. Now, you have to then ask yourself, how much were they making if they could pay £2,400 in rent? The Amawasha, how did they use their money? When they made a profit, they reinvested that money in farms or on farms. They bought cattle, they bought farms in KwaZulu so that they reduced their chances of being laborers. They always wanted to be owners of businesses. What happens to the Amawasha business? Well, a few years later, in the early 1900s, they are accused of being unhygienic. Rather than finding a solution to the health problems on the Braamfontein Spruit, they are taken 2 hours away from their market into Klipspruit, and they lose access to market. And instead, new laundry service providers who are European and who've got connections to mechanized machine or machinery abroad are given an opportunity to take advantage of that market. And that was said. Richard Baloyi, he was born in 1897 in Limpopo. By 1927, just before he had turned 30, he already had buses. He had started in 1922 as a taxi driver, and he became a taxi owner in 1925. 1927, he became a bus owner. Why did he start a bus service? He started a bus service between Alexandra and Johannesburg, the CBD. So you can imagine that his buses must have rode across what is now the Louis Botha Avenue, from Alexandra, Orange Grove, up Houghton, Yeoville, into Johannesburg and downtown CBD. And that's what Baloyi did. And why did he do that? He was entrepreneurial. He knew the system had located Black people into the periphery or outside town. And he knew that Black people needed a transport service to get to their workplace in town. And so started a fleet of buses. And he did so well. You know, in the 1950s, Baloyi got sick and he needed medical attention. You know, he applies to the Native Commissioner to get health assistance in America. So as he applies for the passport, the Department of Home Affairs then responds and says, Mr. Baloyi and his wife are well off. They will not be a burden to the American state, as the wife collects about 150 pounds monthly on properties. Mr. Baloyi has a fleet of buses. These people are well off. But what happens to Mr. Baloyi's entrepreneurship? Rules are introduced. All of a sudden, they have to load within a set timetable. The Public Utility Transport Company, in short, PUTCO, is introduced and is subsidized. Now, how do you compete? And PUTCO then was ran by white management. Of course, it did introduce some black clerks to manage the market. That's what happened to Baloyi's business and many others. And that cost them a great deal because they couldn't compete. Again, you know, if people have anti-competitive behavior and they introduce racial laws, how do you fix it in the market? You do not use traffic regulations, do you?
Thank you so much, and thank you for that background for our audience. And just another one, quickly looking at, so one of the things that you look at is the financial institutions, like the building of financial institutions, particularly for Black people, because there was a lot of bias against white people, Black people in the financial institutions. And also the whole thing about letting capital circulate in Black hands. So sometimes when we talk about having a financial institution that is black, the first thing we go to is VBS. Of course, it's going to fail. It's something Black people can't do. And so those are just some of the biases that come out, and we completely forget about Sambo Bank, where Edwards de Klerk and Myburgh were the accused for corruption in that same bank. So I think this it speaks to us generally as a nation, and some of the brainwashing and some of the messaging that actually happens in the public space on what industries Black people can participate and be successful in, and which ones they cannot be successful in by virtue of color.
Sure. I mean, the whole issue of starting Black-owned financial institutions, this is not a post-1994 affair, right? Now, there was a reverend in the Eastern Cape in the 1800s, Reverend Mbangela. You know, he was a farmer. You know, they established what was called the Penny Savings and Investment Society in 1922. And they listed directors. They had a memorandum of incorporation. They listed directors, people like Thomas Ntlebi, Edward Venner, you know, the elite of the day. And the idea of the Penny Savings and Investment Society was to collect, this is 1922, right? It was to collect deposits from Black people so that the same deposits can be used to lend to other Black people for business initiatives. It was not just the people in the Eastern Cape, you know, I mean, in 1877, you know, there was the Ibandla laseTopia, you know, which had about 409 pounds in the bank. You know, these are savings from Black people. It had about 100 members, you know, and the bulk of them came from Port Elizabeth, right? But if you come to Cape Town, where I am, you know, the colored members of the African People's Organization, that is Dr. Abdullah Abdul Rahman's political party, one of the first doctors, you know, they started a benefit society which operated in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Kimberley. Its shareholders were largely colored people with a few European friends. The APO Building Society had about 106,000 pounds in assets in its inception. In 1935, its subscription had exceeded 250,000 pounds, right? And that money was used to fund properties. So they pulled monies together, and those funds would be used as home loans or business loans for whatever that was deemed as productive and value accretive. So the culture of starting financial services institutions was not new. I mean, Z.K. Matthews in 1957 had tried to start a deposit-taking institution to fund, you know, Black needs or the needs of Black business people or Black consumers. AWG Champion and Msimang had started Isikhwama Sabantu in KwaZulu. Unfortunately, during the apartheid years, members of the security branch visited Champion and Msimang because they were also ANC members. And they said, you guys are starting a fund to fund terrorism. And sadly, that fund could not continue. Of course, the earlier funds that were started, I must also indicate, those that were started as burial societies, they did have some underwriting challenges where if your liabilities become higher than your subscriptions, then you have to deal with. And those are things that are not unique to Black business people. Those are challenges that are unique that are general to businesses as a whole. I'm not going to program direct your session, Siphetile, but I see there are some questions and I don't want to be seen as dodging. Yeah.
No. We love hearing from you. We're definitely going to go to those questions. And I think just linking it from the businesses that we've been talking about, and this particular question is that, was the dispossession an act of government of the day or individual white business people? So yeah, so if you can answer that, and you did address this in the book, and yeah,
well, I'll answer it. I'll answer it. So if you look at mining in Kimberley in 1875, strange enough, there were liberals in government, Barclay and Southey. So Henry Barclay was the governor of the Cape, and Southey was Richard Southey was the colonial administrator in Griqualand West, which covered Kimberley, which was the mining area. Now Southey wanted a non-racial policy on mining. He did not want, you know, the dispossession of licenses. He was a colonial administrator, but I must say it, he was against, you know, the dispossession of Black people of their mines, of their mining licenses. But what happened? You see, business is powerful, and Marx and Friedrich Engels once said something in the Communist Manifesto, that the bourgeoisie are the real directors of a country or an economy, and the politicians are just an executive committee who implement those board decisions. Sadly, in Kimberley, a group of miners, many of them with foreign interests, who wanted to build big monopoly, told government that they were not going to take it anymore. And those business interests started a police force on their own, and they started their own government in Kimberley, parallel to the colonial administration. And hell broke loose. Yes. Now, the government of the day found itself very compromised because these people, many of them all came from Europe and England. So it was just going to be difficult for them to suppress, their fellow brothers. So it became a very sophisticated thing. But to answer the question, dispossession was led from a business front and a government and a government position. You will know, even in modern terms, the people who influence the shaping of legislation, it's corporates, because certain legislation affects the way their business is done and they contribute to papers in parliament. Of course, government also writes legislation using, not government, the legislature. Parliament writes legislation responding to needs of societies or certain things that are bad in society. So to answer, it's both business and government that was involved.
What I also found very interesting there was when there was very much that very antagonistic element that came from Kimberley. And in fact, one of the things was, one of our problems is that we won't know if the Black person who has the stone has stolen it or if it's theirs. So it kind of laid an assumption that Black equal thievery, but if you're white, you definitely own the stone. But if you're Black, there's a question on whether you own the stone or you've stolen it. So, and then another one is when Black people were then dispossessed of their lands. There were white people who were upset that Black people were dispossessed of their lands because they were actually leasing that land to Black people and getting a share of the crop as well, which meant business would be going down for those white people as well. And then you also mentioned that there was an Afrikaner group that was pro-apartheid, pro-segregation, but wanted to do business with Black people, but because of the legislation were prohibited from that. So like history is really intertwined with these many things, and it's a kind of complex, very complex. We have another question here, and I think it's from Kevin Mart. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. And he says his main reason for interest in the book is that he's Khoi and how they are a First Nation and robbed of their land and killed for their livestock. I must say, Kevin, this is very much covered in the book, and it is well documented. It's in fact within the first chapters of the book, and there's a beautiful, rich history that's written in there. That's brought in from those archives at the time. Phakamisa, would you like to add?
I'll respond. Kevin, the Khoi people have been trading with Europeans before the arrival of the Dutch East India Company in 1652. You will remember that they traded with the Portuguese, and there was a skirmish in 1510 where the Khoi killed one Admiral Francisco de Almeida because the Portuguese were trying to cheat the Khoi of their livestock in the trade. And the Khoi wouldn't take it lying down. They didn't play with their darts. Any crook that tried to dispossess them of their livestock, that crook would meet the fate of the darts, which was a very sharp spear that they used and shot with. They traded with the English East India Company, the Khoi. In 1613, a Khoi chief, Tori, whom I mention in the book, is kidnapped by the English East India Company. And the reason why the English East India Company kidnaps Tori is so that they can teach him English ways and so that Tori can open up trade for the English in the Cape. Nowadays, it's called public affairs in corporate speak. When Tori was kidnapped and taken to England, he was taught English and all these English things. But Tori soon discovers in England in 1613 that actually the copper that the Khoi have been taking and exchanging their cattle with was really not worth the copper, or the copper was not worth the livestock. When Tori comes back, he conferences with his Khoi people and he tells them that, guys, we need to up the cost of livestock. Of course, there was no money then, but how did they do it? For every copper or brass, the European, or for every cow, the European needed to put more copper plates in order to get, so they needed to bring stash of copper and base metal and base metals for the livestock. Even Jan van Riebeeck, when he arrives here, the whole notion of arriving to empty land in South Africa, even Jan van Riebeeck does not believe that. In his diary, Jan van Riebeeck says, when we arrived here, there were these guys who were very stingy with their cattle and their sheep. And it took a lot of trading and bartering for them to give us their livestock. So the whole issue of empty land, even Jan van Riebeeck does not believe it. It doesn't exist. It is not in his diary, which, by the way, I bought. Jan van Riebeeck acknowledges that he met people here. Whether the Khoi are the first people, that is a big debate, Kevin, right? Because when the Khoi were in the Cape, remember I mentioned that in the 800s, there are the Bavenda people already in Musina who are mining, and exporting mineral resources to Asia. So I think we've got to really reshape the issue of the first people in Southern Africa, because it tends to be abused also for anti-transformation purposes. Yes, the Khoi must be acknowledged for the work that they did, and there must be perhaps a consideration of a reparation, in their destruction. But I'm not sure if the Khoi were the first people, because the Vavenda, as I've indicated, and many people were already mining in the Iron Age, right? In the 800s, in the 1000s. Yeah. How do we unite? At the end of the book, DDT Jabavu says, and I'll quote, if I remember, please pardon me. He says, let us learn how to support our own traders, however humble they may be, out of a patriotic spirit of African nationalism. That is what DDT Jabavu says. But if you read more in the book, you will also understand that in a capitalist world, Kevin, you can never do business in a racial manner. You need to do business in a non-racial manner, if you are serious about doing business and building a non-racial country. I subscribe to a non-racial society, and I believe there ought to be cooperation between black and white and white business people. When Jabavu wanted to start a newspaper, yes, Jabavu and Bokwe raised a bond of about 400 pounds, but they raised the money from white funders, the Wares family, Rose Inns, When Paul Koniwe wanted to start a hotel in King Williamstown, yes, he put in some of his savings, but he had to raise money from the West family. When Z.K. Matthews, in the peak of apartheid, and many African National Congress leaders started the African Horizon Insurance Company, they didn't start it as Black people. They also started it with people such as Simon Heller, who were white. So I think if we are serious about growing big business, we ought to cooperate in a non-racial manner. But this time around, we've got to bring skills. We shouldn't be rent collectors. The guys in the book were not rent collectors. They were very active in building businesses. I'm not criticizing rent collecting because it is also a way of investing. If you buy shares, you are a rent collector, and there's nothing wrong about that. But if you are given an opportunity to participate in a big deal, I think it becomes a disgrace when you are just rent collecting and not contributing to operations or using that rent to build new operations. I hope that answers you, Kevin.
I think, well, I hope so. He'll confirm for us. So just to wrap up, just one more question from Colin is why bootlegging is so rife in our townships and who were the brewers? So just something that I think we just have to get to, a point that we have to get to as a nation is move away from, we have to understand that there's a lot of legislation and there's a lot of red tape and there's a lot of bylaws that were put in townships to make sure that Black people do not rise above laborer, which is why then you're gonna go into the Shebeen breweries bootlegging, because then you are going to encourage more illicit trading. And in fact, I was in a webinar once where there was this group that was particularly breaking down those bylaws that are still precluding people in townships from fully fledging their businesses. So I think we kind of have to move away from those thoughts that we're jealous of each other, we want to bring each other down, we only want to be involved in illicit trade. We must focus on why this actually is and take down those barriers. We have a couple of minutes left before we have to wrap up. Any last words?
Sure. You know, Spetile and the Property Point crew, we will learn from native merchants that the natives that built properties back in the day syndicated capital. You see, this whole notion of I is a distraction to Black empowerment. I, Phakamisa, is starting this and I am my own boss. If we want to grow massive businesses, guys who are members of Property Point or subscribe to the Property Point platform have got to think about putting a fund themselves and saying, we want to buy a property in Sandton, or we want to build a property in Soweto or wherever using our own money. And each of us will have 5% of the business. We must never be trapped by this notion of 100% owned, or even 51% for that matter. Yes, 51% is key to equity control, right? But let's make an example of a modern business such as Discovery, or a modern business such as Investec. The founders of the bank, not the company Investec, the bank, Investec Bank, I think Stephen Kosef never owned 1% of Investec, but he was in charge. He controlled it. How? He had intellectual capital. He understood the business. And the shareholders backed him as the jockey because they saw him as the best captain to run it. You look at Adrian Gore at Discovery. He started the business, but he never had 51%. I think he owns 10% and his friends, Barry Schwartzberg, had 5%. So they had 15%. But they controlled it because they understood the product so well, right? They were not just investors with money or, they knew the product. So when we start businesses as Black people, we've got to understand the product. When you understand the product, you will control the business. I promise you, you will control the boardroom because the shareholders will back you. They back you because they cannot run the business themselves. Here are limitations, and this is textbook cases. And even Uma mentions it in the book, even Mweli Scotta mentions it. There is a reason why you start a limited liability company. Limited, LTD today. They were talking about these things in the early 1900s. The reason why you start a limited liability company is because you want to share your risk and raise capital optimally. When you do not have limited liability and you are 100% owned, you take up the full liability and you are restricted from raising capital. However, when you bring in 200 to 100 like-minded people, you spread your risk and you raise your money at the same time. That's why I think that's what is needed. And I will part with those words unless colleagues on the platform have some questions.
I think we'll be wrapping it up for today. Thank you so much. I appreciated you coming on. And to our audience, this is the cover for Native Merchants. I hope that's perfectly seen on the screen. And I really, really recommend on reading this book. It has for me, like the only thing I can say when I read it is like literally it collapsed time for me. It's because we always think we're on this linear journey, but there were liberals then as there are liberals today. There were conservatives then as the conservatives today. And there were some things we could do then that we can't do today, vice versa. So it's really enlightening, and thank you so much for it. And I do believe it's one of those books that will become collector's items. So get yourself a copy. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic evening. Thank you for joining us on Entrepreneurship to the Point.
Thanks for the privilege, and all the best in your initiatives.
Thank you.